Hey, so I've been thinking about intellectual property and how strange it is uh, in the terms of a capitalist marketplace, or in this internet age where storage and computation and all this stuff is just, it's so unbridled, it's so open. The potential for something to be stolen and then shared for data, for intellectual property, let's say a movie, to be stolen and shared across the world is very, very possible, very doable. So that's something that's, I think some of this stuff needs to change. So consider intellectual property from a few angles. So imagine Nintendo makes, and Nintendo is a good example here because Nintendo is a company that enforces their copyrights and their intellectual property with legal force. So imagine they make a Metroid game. They make a Metroid game, and there's like 3 levels of property that get created. There's the actual physical cartridge that has the game on it, and if you were to, break into Nintendo's warehouse and go to their stack of cartridges and go and take one, I think everyone would have a pretty solid understanding that that was a bad thing that you did there. Pretty clear cut. So the next layer of property that's in that cartridge are the ones and zeros that exist that are loaded into the cartridge. So if you, an owner of that cartridge, this is the weird thing, never mind, I'll come back to that. If you, the person who purchased that cartridge, look at the ones and zeros that are on the cartridge and then make your own copy of ones and zeros in that exact same order and configuration, and you keep it for your purposes in the case that the cartridge gets damaged, is that illegal? That's a bit more questionable. Now, if you take those ones and zeros and you put them online and you say, hey, look, these are the ones and zeros that are inside that cartridge that I purchased, that is, by strict interpretation, illegal. It is illegal to share the ones and zeros that are deemed to be proprietary. It's like the contents of what's inside the cartridge. But the contents is ethereal, and the contents is just an order of ones and zeros. And if you make your own order of ones and zeros, it is literally illegal for you to have that and do stuff with it. So if I were to make a program that just randomly generated ones and zeros, and they happen to generate in the configuration of the Metroid game that gets loaded onto the cartridge, that fact is irrelevant, because that's Nintendo's copyrighted set of ones and zeros. It's pretty weird. So that's that level of property that Nintendo has. Ones and zeros, that's an intellectual idea. It's strange. It's very strange. And that's where things get a little bit grayer as far as what is malum in se and malum in prohibitum. It's bad because it's illegal and bad because it's bad. Like if I kill someone, that's bad. But if I run through a red light, that's still pretty bad. I'm breaking the rules. But what if it was an emergency? It's less, there's gray areas. The other thing that makes it a little bit more interesting is, like I mentioned earlier, you don't technically own everything that's on there. Much like I don't technically own this phone. This phone does stuff. This is where I'm not going to transform into Richard Stallman or channel his ghost. Rest his soul. He's actually alive. He's doing just fine, actually. The end user license agreement requires that you give up your rights in the ownership, in the purchase of this thing. Sony had this bit a while ago where they were producing their CDs, and music is a very interesting topic as far as intellectual property goes, because music is almost literally intellectual property. It's a collection of notes and a series of beats and spaces where there are not beats. So when you purchased a compact disc, you are purchasing a CD, a printed CD that has a physical presence, but you're also purchasing the ones and zeros that are on it. So figure that out. You're actually purchasing not a CD, but you're purchasing a license to play that music. And that license allows you to play the music in very specific circumstances. Much like a DVD, those FBI warnings that everyone ignores in the beginning. That tells you that the thing that's on this DVD doesn't technically exist, and if you reproduce it, or recreate it, or intentionally copy it, or share it in a manner that exceeds your license, then it's illegal. So, you run into this very strange situation where ones and zeros are things that you're allowed to use, but only in certain circumstances. Those ones and zeros get passed around and used in different projects, and that's why if you have a modern BMW, you can send an email to BMW and say, hey, I would like to understand the rights and the licensing agreement that is required for the operation of my car. And they'll send you a copy of the GPL license, at least the affected software that they used. So it's the sharing of this software, this intellectual property, but the licenses stick with it all the way through, every step of the way. So, what is wrong with the system? I'm not sure. I don't think it's okay for things that are... so here, let me do a kind of a problem statement. So I have a CD-ROM, right, or a CD, a compact disc that has music on it. And by purchasing the CD, I have agreed to a license, by purchasing the license, I should say, to play the CD under very specific circumstances. Now, if that CD becomes damaged, technically, I have a license to play something that I physically cannot play anymore. I don't have a physical copy of it. My question is, should I be able to, or is it possible to reach out to Sony and say, hey, I purchased a copy of your album, the album that you produced. I'm sorry, I didn't purchase a copy. I purchased a license to play this album that you produced, and my hard copy became damaged. And so I would like you to provide me with an updated copy to be able to fulfill my end, your end of the license, I suppose. It is your end, it's Sony's end of the license, because they're letting you play it. They're not letting you play it if the media that it is on degrades to the point of uselessness. So, let's flip this back to the video game console. I can't buy certain video game consoles. It is impossible to purchase them. At least not new. You know, I'm sure there's like an aftermarket. Yeah, there's probably some video game console out there that is impossible to purchase at this point. Can't get it. So, what happens to that intellectual property, the ones and zeros that are on the cartridge? Yes, the cartridges are long gone, and if I purchase that cartridge, I purchase a license to play those series of ones and zeros under very specific circumstances. Now, if that console doesn't exist, and that cartridge doesn't exist, and the company that owns the intellectual property, in order to play that video game, or to play the music for that matter, if they are not actively producing something that can allow me, a licensor of that media, to be able to use it, what is it? Do I get a refund? Like, I have a license that is useless because the company stopped making the product. What is the purpose of this license? And is that okay? Should there be consumer protections to allow something like that to happen? Now, I don't think that should be the case. I'm merely pointing out the injustice that is there. My recommendation for something like this is something to the effect of an expiring patent on intellectual property. Now, the DCMA doesn't allow that, obviously. Any DCMA code can be copyrighted in any way, and if it's reproduced by, monkeys typing ones and zeros on a set of typewriters, it's still illegal to have that. It's illegal to possess a series of ones and zeros. Figure that out. So, I think there should be an expiration. Possibly an expiration for the series of ones and zeros that exists on the cartridge. Now, I said that there were three forms of media, or three forms of not patent protection, but property that are on that game cartridge. The first is the actual cartridge itself, the physical copy of the cartridge, and that's very clear cut as to what would happen if you were to steal it. The next is the ones and zeros that exist on, in this case we're talking about a game of Metroid or something like that, the ones and zeros of that particular game, Metroid 2, you know, Samus Return, Ultra, Double, Hyper, Mega, whatever, doesn't matter. It's the ones and zeros of that particular game. The last form of intellectual property is the personage and the characters represented in those games. So in that case, like, I can't make a Metroid game, because if I use that Metroid name and I use the Samus character, I am infringing on their intellectual property for those characters that exist. So that's not okay. But, you know, Nintendo still may make more Metroid games, but they will at no point make that exact series of ones and zeros again, because that is specific to the console, or specific to the media, or specific to the player, in the case of a CD. So while it's unlikely that CDs will cease to be useful, you know, CD players will stop existing, or the codec will, or the format will stop existing, what's more likely is that, you know, an NES console is impossible to obtain. So what happens to those ones and zeros? Well, I contend that it is a waste of human ability and effort to let those ones and zeros of that particular game, for that particular console, be, you know, clutched onto, to be held onto forever. This is like a, I want to say like a patent troll kind of thing, but you're taking something that is art, that is the production of human beings and made to bring, you know, joy into the world and all that, or even, this applies to software as well, perhaps even software that's for companies that don't exist anymore, or companies that are no longer, or make software for operating systems that don't exist anymore, to be able to emulate those things and to use those ones and zeros that would have been loaded on the cartridge. I'm not talking about new, you don't get every new Metroid game that comes out, or even remakes, because the remakes are not the same series of ones and zeros. But you have this like elephant graveyard of property that is just not being used, and yet is still being actively enforced as when people try to reproduce ROMs in the case of video games. So there's a term in software, old software, called abandonware, and that's software that is abandoned in some regard, either by the copyright holder or by anyone who would have had any kind of stake or claim over that, or it's for a system that no longer exists anymore, that cannot be commercially purchased and isn't being commercially produced. So, like, I think that to have access to those things should be some, I don't want to say the R word, it's not a right. I think that it is a good thing to do, and it's something that should be applauded and promoted. I just don't think that someone can say, you purchased a license to this game, or we produced this thing and we're protecting it, ostensibly because it has value. Now, if it doesn't have value, how can it have value if you cannot use it? It's an interesting thing I've been thinking about for a while, and I don't have the solution, but I'm very interested in your thoughts and other thoughts on it.